February 1942. The North Atlantic. A British destroyer cuts through heavy seas, hunting. Somewhere below the grey waves, a German U-boat is running for its life. The destroyer's captain has been tracking the submarine for 20 minutes. The ASDIC operator, headphones pressed tight against his ears, calls out bearing and range with the steady rhythm of a countdown. Contact confirmed. 1,200 yards. 1,000. 800. The captain orders attack speed. The ship surges forward, engines straining, bow cutting through the swells. Every man on deck braces himself. The gun crews stand ready. The depth charge teams check their racks one more time. 600 yards. 400. 200. And then, at the exact moment the destroyer passes over the submarine, the ASDIC operator speaks the words that every U-boat hunter in the Atlantic dreads to hear. Contact lost. The target has vanished. The depth charges roll off the stern racks and splash into the churning wake. Explosions thunder through the water. Massive columns of white foam erupt behind the ship, taller than the mast. The concussions shake the hull. It sounds like war. It looks like war. But the captain already knows the truth. He knows what every escort commander in the North Atlantic knows. In the 30 seconds between losing sonar contact and the depth charges actually reaching the water, the submarine has changed course, changed depth, slipped away into the black below. The destroyer circles back to the spot where the explosions faded. The ASDIC operator searches the water with desperate concentration, pinging into the void, hoping for an echo that doesn't come. Nothing. The U-boat has escaped. Again. This scene repeated itself thousands of times during the Battle of the Atlantic. Escort vessels chasing submarines they could track but couldn't kill, failing over and over again. Not because the crews weren't brave, not because the ships weren't capable, but because the weapon they depended on had a fatal, fundamental flaw built into its very design. You had to drop depth charges behind your ship, which meant you had to sail directly over the submarine first, which meant you lost sonar contact at the critical moment of attack. For 2 years, this was the grim reality of anti-submarine warfare. Chase the U-boat, lose contact, drop charges, pray. The U-boats were winning this war of attrition. Merchant ships were dying by the hundreds, and Britain was slowly being strangled. Then a scientist had an idea so simple that the entire British Admiralty laughed at him. What if, instead of dropping weapons behind the ship, we fire them forward? What if we attack while we can still see the target? This is the story of the Hedgehog, the weapon that nobody wanted, the weapon that changed the Battle of the Atlantic, the weapon that sank 47 German U-boats, and the story of the man who had to fight his own navy, his own allies, and 2 decades of entrenched doctrine to make it happen. To understand why the Hedgehog mattered, you need to understand the catastrophe unfolding in the Atlantic in 1940 and 41. Germany's U-boat campaign was the single greatest threat Britain faced during the entire war. Greater than the Luftwaffe bombing London every night. Greater even than the very real threat of German invasion. Because Britain was an island nation that imported virtually everything it needed to survive and to fight. Food for 55 million people. Oil to fuel the factories. Steel and aluminium for aircraft. Ammunition for the armies. Every bullet, every tank, every loaf of bread crossed the Atlantic in merchant ships. And the U-boats were sinking those ships faster than the Allies could build replacements. In 1940 alone, German submarines sent over 2 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the ocean. In 1941, another 2 million tons followed. Month after month, convoy after convoy. The losses were relentless. Winston Churchill, who had faced the Blitz with defiance and the fall of France with determination, later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing during the entire war that truly frightened him. Because, without the convoys, Britain would starve within weeks. The factories would fall silent. The war would simply be over. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, had devised a tactic that made the slaughter even worse. Wolf packs. Instead of individual submarines hunting alone, Dönitz coordinated groups of 5, 10, sometimes 20 U-boats to converge on a single convoy simultaneously. One submarine would find the convoy and shadow it, staying just beyond sonar range, radioing position reports back to U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France. Dönitz would then vector every available boat toward the target like a chess master moving pieces across a board. The boats gathered ahead of the convoy and waited. They attacked at night, on the surface, running on diesel engines, where they were invisible to sonar and nearly invisible to radar. The escorts couldn't be everywhere at once. Ships exploded without warning. The merchant sailors never knew what hit them. The Royal Navy's primary anti-submarine weapon was the depth charge. A steel barrel, about the size of an oil drum, filled with 300 pounds of high explosive, usually amatol or TNT. A pressure fuse set to detonate at a specific depth, anywhere from 50 feet to 500. Sailors rolled them off racks at the stern or launched them from K-gun throwers mounted on the sides. The charge sank, reached the preset depth, and exploded with tremendous force. A shockwave moving through water at nearly 5,000 feet per second. If the blast occurred within 20 feet of a submarine, the pressure wave crushed the hull like a tin can. Even a near miss at 50 feet could rupture seams, crack welds, and force the boat to surface. The depth charge was proven, reliable, understood by every escort commander in the fleet. It was also deeply and fundamentally flawed. The flaw was geometry. Escort vessels detected submarines using ASDIC, the British name for active sonar. The system worked by sending pulses of sound into the water from a transducer mounted beneath the hull. When the pulse struck something solid, part of the sound bounced back as an echo. A trained ASDIC operator could calculate the submarine's range, bearing, and speed from that echo. The equipment itself was impressive for its era. The transducer generated a pulse at around 14 kilohertz, with an effective range of roughly 2,500 yards in good conditions. A skilled operator could track a submarine with remarkable precision, but ASDIC had a fatal limitation that no amount of skill could overcome. The sonar beam projected outward and downward from the ship's hull. It could not look straight down. As the escort approached its target, the beam angle grew steeper and steeper, the contact less reliable. Inside 200 yards, the signal became intermittent, sometimes there and sometimes not. Inside 100 yards, contact was usually lost entirely. The ship's own hull blocked the transducer. The wake created acoustic interference. The target vanished into a blind zone directly beneath the ship. This was the impossible contradiction at the heart of anti-submarine warfare. You needed to be directly above the submarine to attack it. But the moment you got there, you could no longer see it. 30 seconds of blindness while the depth charges sank to detonation depth. That was all a U-boat commander needed. Hold course until the escort passes overhead. Listen for the telltale splashes of charges entering the water. Count the seconds. Then turn hard, change depth, and move. By the time the explosions thundered through the water, the submarine was somewhere else entirely. Experienced U-boat commanders turned survival into a science. They learned exactly how long a depth charge took to sink to various depths. They knew the turning radius of British corvettes and destroyers. Some kept stopwatches running during attacks. Wait for the escort to pass. Count to 3. Hard starboard. Flood negative. Go deep. The explosions came behind and above, where the boat used to be. It was absolutely terrifying. The hull groaned, light bulbs shattered, men prayed. But it was survivable. And it was survivable time after time after time. The statistics told the full story. Analysis showed that a single depth charge attack had roughly a 5% success rate, 1 chance in 20. The average U-boat required 10 to 15 separate attacks before it was finally destroyed. 10 to 15 passes through the blind zone. Escort crews knew the odds. They attacked anyway, because the alternative was watching the convoys burn. The frustration was corrosive. Men risked their lives again and again, doing everything right, and the submarines kept escaping. Something fundamental had to change, and one man saw exactly what needed changing. The man who changed everything was Commander Charles Goodeve, Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. Born in 1904 in Neepawa, Manitoba, a tiny prairie town far from any ocean. The kind of place where people knew each other's names, and the biggest excitement was the Harvest Festival. An unlikely origin for a man who would revolutionize naval warfare. Goodeve was not a typical naval officer. He was a scientist first and a sailor second. A chemist with a doctorate from University College London. Colleagues described him as relentlessly logical, stubborn to the point of infuriating, and completely indifferent to rank or tradition when he believed he was right. He had joined the Navy at the outbreak of war because he believed his scientific mind could solve problems that career officers had accepted as simply the way things were. One of his first breakthroughs was degaussing, the defense against German magnetic mines. These mines sat on the seabed and detected the magnetic field of a passing ship. When the field was strong enough, the mine detonated. Devastating, difficult to sweep, causing enormous losses in 39 and 40. Goodeve helped develop electrical cables that wrapped around a ship's hull and generated a counterfield, erasing the vessel's magnetic signature. The mines simply couldn't detect the ship. Degaussing saved hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. It earned Goodeve a promotion, a reputation, and an assignment that would change the war. That assignment was the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapon Development, nicknamed the Wheezers and Dodgers. A small department with almost no budget, almost no staff, and almost no authority. Their job was to develop weapons too unusual or too risky for the established departments. The place where ideas that didn't fit anywhere else went to live or die. Here, Goodeve had freedom, and he used that freedom to attack the depth charge problem. He studied attack data. He interviewed exhausted escort commanders. He ran the mathematics. And he reached a conclusion that his superiors absolutely did not want to hear. The fundamental approach was wrong. The Navy was trying to improve depth charges, make them sink faster, explode bigger, tighter patterns. But none of these improvements addressed the actual problem, the blind spot, the loss of contact, the 30 seconds when the submarine escaped. The real solution was conceptually simple. Attack from ahead, not from above. Fire the weapon forward while sonar contact was still strong. In 1940, this was heresy. Naval doctrine had been built around the stern-launched depth charge for 20 years. Every tactic, every training manual, every ship design assumed you attacked from behind. Goodeve wrote a formal proposal and submitted it to the Director of Anti-Submarine Warfare. The response was devastating. Senior officers dismissed it almost immediately. The bombs would be too small to damage a submarine. The training burden was too high. 24 separate launchers meant 24 things that could fail. And beneath the official objections lay an unspoken truth that nobody would say aloud. If this forward-firing weapon works, it means we've been wrong for 20 years. It means sailors died because we refused to think differently. That was an accusation no admiral could accept, but Goodeve found an ally in the most unlikely of places. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker was a retired British Army officer with a magnificent moustache and an obsession that his family considered slightly embarrassing. He had spent the better part of 2 decades developing a weapon called the spigot mortar. Unlike conventional mortars that fired shells through rifled tubes, Blacker's design was elegantly simple. A steel rod stuck up from the launcher. The bomb sat on top of the rod like a ball on a tee. A propellant charge at the base launched the bomb upward and outward. No heavy gun barrel required, no complex breech mechanism. Lightweight, simple, and capable of rapid fire. Blacker had tried to sell his invention to the British Army for years. They weren't interested. When Goodeve explained the depth charge problem, Blacker immediately saw the application. His rejected spigot mortar could throw bombs forward from a ship's deck. Within weeks, they built a prototype in a workshop that would have embarrassed a serious weapons manufacturer. 24 spigot mortars, arranged in 6 rows of 4 on a heavy steel frame, their rods pointing skyward like the spines of a hedgehog. That's how it got its name. The entire assembly weighed about 4 tons and sat on the forecastle deck ahead of the bridge. Each bomb weighed 65 pounds total, with 35 pounds of Torpex high explosive, one of the most powerful conventional explosives available, packed into a 7-inch diameter steel casing. The bombs launched in rapid sequence, each one leaving the spigot with a distinctive thud that sounded nothing like any weapon the Navy had ever used. And here was the innovation that changed everything about anti-submarine warfare. Contact fuse only. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at a preset depth regardless of whether they hit anything, Hedgehog bombs exploded only when they physically struck a solid object. This contact fuse transformed the entire nature of the weapon. If you heard nothing after firing, you knew instantly that you had missed. No need to wait, no need to wonder, no false hope from explosions that killed nothing but fish. Silence meant failure. Begin your next attack run immediately. And if you did hit, the result was catastrophic for the submarine. 35 pounds of Torpex detonating on direct contact with a pressure hull was far more lethal than a 300-pound depth charge exploding 20 yards away. The 24 bombs landed in an elliptical pattern roughly 250 yards ahead of the ship. While ASDIC contact was still solid, tests at HMS Vernon in late 1941 confirmed the concept. The bombs flew on predicted trajectories and landed in predicted patterns. The contact fuses, after months of painstaking refinement, achieved reliability above 95%. Goodeve had the weapon. He had the proof. He had the mathematics showing that forward-firing attacks were dramatically more effective than stern-launched depth charges. And the Admiralty still dragged its feet. Months of meetings, more objections, more delays. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U-boats were about to make Goodeve's argument for him. In January 1942, Germany launched Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, the Drumbeat. Admiral Dönitz sent his best long-range Type 9 U-boats to the American East Coast. What they found was beyond anything they had dared to hope. Coastal cities blazing with lights at night. No blackout whatsoever. Miami, New York, Atlantic City, lit up like peacetime. Ships sailing alone, unescorted, following peacetime routes published in nautical almanacs that anyone could buy for a few dollars. Silhouetted against the bright shoreline, the merchant ships were perfect targets, black shapes against a wall of light. The American Navy had rushed most of its destroyers to the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. The entire East Coast was essentially undefended. The U-boat commanders couldn't believe their luck. They called it the second happy time. The results were catastrophic. January, 25 ships sunk off the American coast. February, 32. March, 48. Oil tankers were the favorite targets, burning so close to shore that the flames were visible from the boardwalks of New Jersey. Vacationers watched ships die from beach hotels. American Admiral Ernest King stubbornly refused to implement convoys, convinced that weakly escorted convoys were worse than none at all. British officers crossed the Atlantic to share their experience. They were politely and firmly ignored. In the first 6 months of 42, over 3 million tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom. More than in all of 41. The political pressure finally overwhelmed institutional resistance. Suddenly, the Admiralty's elegant objections to Hedgehog seemed a great deal less important than the ships dying every night. In early 1942, the first Hedgehog systems were installed on active escort vessels. Ships had to come out of convoy duty for modifications right in the middle of the worst crisis of the entire war. Every ship mattered. Every day mattered more. But the depth charges weren't working. Everyone could see it now. The old way was killing the convoys as surely as the torpedoes. The first combat firings of Hedgehog were not encouraging. Ships missed. Crews fumbled the unfamiliar procedure. Fuses malfunctioned. Several early attacks produced nothing but silence and embarrassment. The skeptics in the Admiralty felt vindicated. We told you so. Too small, too complicated, too different. Goodeve studied every failure report, identified the problems, refined the training procedures. The weapon wasn't failing. The crews hadn't learned it yet. He needed time. And in February 42, time was running out. On February 6, 1942, the corvette HMS Dewar was escorting convoy ONS 67. 37 merchant ships spread across miles of grey Atlantic. A U-boat was detected. Dewar's captain had been trained on Hedgehog, but had never used it in combat. His crew was deeply skeptical. They knew depth charges. They knew the familiar rhythm of a conventional attack. Now they were trusting their lives to a weapon that looked like a factory accident, bolted to the forecastle by dockyard workers who seemed almost as uncertain about it as the sailors. The ASDIC operator tracked the submarine with practiced precision. Bearing steady, range closing steadily, 300 yards, 250. The captain gave the order to fire. 24 Hedgehog bombs arced forward through the grey sky and splashed into the Atlantic in their elliptical pattern. They disappeared beneath the surface. And then, silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The crews stared at the water where the bombs had vanished. Some were already reaching for the depth charge controls, certain the new weapon had failed. Then a single muffled boom rose from the deep. A contact detonation. Every man on deck froze. Seconds later, a second explosion. Then a third, as the submarine's hull collapsed and its systems ruptured in a chain reaction of destruction. Oil rose to the surface in a dark, spreading stain. Debris followed. Air bubbles marked the exact position of a dying submarine. HMS Dewar had made history. The first confirmed Hedgehog kill. U-581, Type 7C. 45 men aboard, all lost. 1 salvo, 3 hits, 1 dead U-boat. The weapon nobody wanted had just proved it worked. But proving a weapon works and getting a navy to adopt it are very different battles. Despite the confirmed kill, many captains refused to use Hedgehog. The resistance was psychological as much as tactical. Depth charges gave you massive, satisfying explosions, towering columns of water shooting skyward, the ship shaking from the blast. It felt like combat. It felt like you were doing something powerful and aggressive, even when you were hitting nothing but empty ocean. Hedgehog was brutally, uncomfortably honest. Miss, and you got silence. Nothing. Just your bombs sinking uselessly into the deep. That silence was devastating to crew morale. No comforting boom to pretend the attack might have worked. No impressive water columns to report to headquarters. Just quiet admission of failure. Goodeve argued passionately that this honesty was a feature, not a flaw. You got instant feedback. You could attack again immediately without circling back and reacquiring contact. You improved faster because you couldn't lie to yourself about your results. But humans prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. The Admiralty eventually had to issue direct orders. Hedgehog-equipped ships will use Hedgehog as their primary weapon. Depth charges as backup only. If you want to see how the Hedgehog ultimately changed the entire war at sea, hit that like button. It really does help us share more forgotten stories from World War II. And subscribe if you haven't already, because next week we're covering another weapon that changed history, another invention that the military didn't want until the enemy forced their hand. Back to the Atlantic, where the weapon that nobody wanted was about to turn the tide of the most important naval campaign of the 20th century. It took months of persistent effort. Successful captains mentoring reluctant ones. Training exercises repeated until the procedures became instinct. Kill after kill, making the statistics undeniable. By mid-42, Hedgehog was proving itself across the convoy routes. 9 submarines destroyed by the end of that year. Over 20 by the end of 43. 47 confirmed kills by war's end. But the raw numbers tell only part of the story. Hedgehog's true impact was psychological, and it extended far beyond the submarines it actually sank. Before Hedgehog, a U-boat that was detected had reasonable odds of escape. The escort had to pass overhead, lose contact, and drop charges into the blind zone. After Hedgehog entered widespread service, that calculus shifted completely. An escort could now attack while maintaining solid sonar contact. It could fire, miss, and immediately fire again without ever losing track of its target. The submarine was pinned, unable to maneuver freely. U-boat commanders became cautious. They broke off attacks earlier. They stayed deep and silent when escorts turned aggressive. How many convoys got through because a submarine chose not to attack? Those numbers will never be known, but the effect was enormous. The Americans adopted Hedgehog in mid-42 and designated it the Mark 10 projector. The US Navy installed it on destroyer escorts, frigates, and patrol craft across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. American crews experienced exactly the same psychological resistance as British ones. They hated the silence of a miss. They wanted the satisfying boom of depth charges. And they went through exactly the same grudging conversion as the kills accumulated and the old weapon's futility became undeniable. By 43, every escort destroyer in the US Navy carried a Hedgehog. May 1943, the turning point of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The month when everything changed. Allied forces destroyed 41 U-boats in a single month, a staggering, unprecedented number. More submarines than Germany could possibly replace. To put it in perspective, Germany was building about 15 to 20 new boats per month. They lost 41 in May alone. The losses shocked Admiral Dönitz so profoundly that he did something no one expected. He ordered the wolf packs to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely. The Great Withdrawal. The hunting grounds that had been the U-boat fleet's domain for 3 years were abandoned virtually overnight. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back. Many factors contributed to this reversal. More escort ships, better radar, long-range patrol aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic gap, code-breaking intelligence from Bletchley Park. But forward-throwing weapons were a decisive piece of the puzzle that made everything else possible. Captain Frederick John Walker, known as Johnny Walker, commanding the 2nd Escort Group from HMS Starling, became the greatest U-boat hunter of the entire war. 23 confirmed kills, a record that would never be equaled. Walker was an aggressive, innovative tactician who used Hedgehog with devastating creativity. He developed what he called the creeping attack. One ship maintained sonar contact at a safe distance, tracking the submarine without alerting it. That ship then radioed precise coordinates to a second vessel, which crept slowly toward the U-boat at minimal speed, its engines barely turning, almost completely silent. The attacking ship fired Hedgehog based entirely on the tracking ship's data. The submarine never heard the approach, never detected the attack coming. The first warning was bombs striking the hull. Walker refined this technique over dozens of engagements, and his success rate was extraordinary. Other escort groups studied and adopted his methods. The creeping attack became standard doctrine across the Royal Navy. And it was only possible because Hedgehog allowed you to attack from a distance, ahead of the target, while sonar contact remained unbroken. The weapon had not only changed the technology, it had changed the tactics of naval warfare. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. In 41 and early 42, submarine veterans spoke of depth charge attacks with grim familiarity. They were terrifying, yes, but they were survivable. Men developed routines, rituals. They knew the pattern. The escort passes, the splashes, the count, the turn, the blasts. After Hedgehog and the creeping attack became widespread, survivors described something different. Attacks came without warning. No sound of an approaching ship, no splashes to count, just sudden explosions against the hull. Men in neighbouring compartments dying before they understood they were under attack. Submariners who had survived dozens of depth-charge runs broke down after a single creeping attack. The weapon had taken away the one thing that kept men functional under pressure: predictability. An improved weapon called Squid appeared in late 1943. Where Hedgehog threw small, contact-fused bombs, Squid launched 3 full-size depth charges, each weighing over 200 pounds, forward in a precise triangular pattern. The charges detonated at the exact depth indicated by a new generation of sonar called Type 147, which could determine target depth with remarkable accuracy. No contact fuse needed. The triangle of explosions bracketed the submarine from 3 directions simultaneously. There was almost nowhere to hide. Squid's kill rate approached an astonishing 50%. 1 in every 2 attacks resulted in a destroyed submarine. Compare that to the original 5% success rate of conventional depth charges. A 10-fold improvement. The era of hoping and praying was over. By 1944, U-boat losses had become catastrophic. Germany lost over 240 submarines that year alone. More boats being sunk than shipyards could build. More experienced crews dying than training programs could replace. The average U-boat captain in 44 was years younger and far less experienced than his predecessors from 41 and 42. Many were on their first patrol. Their crews were hastily trained. The hunter had become the hunted. The psychological effect on the German submarine service was devastating. Morale collapsed. Medical officers reported increasing cases of nervous breakdown before boats even left port. Crews that had once sailed with confidence now wrote farewell letters to their families before departure, expecting never to return. The U-boat arm that had nearly won the war was now sending young men to die in submarines they could barely operate against enemies they could no longer outrun. The Battle of the Atlantic raged for nearly 6 years in total. From September 3rd, 1939, the very first day of the war, to May 8th, 1945, the very last. The longest continuous military campaign of the entire conflict. 2,074 days of uninterrupted warfare beneath the waves. Germany lost 783 U-boats, 28,000 German submariners killed. The arithmetic is almost unbearable. 3 out of every 4 men who served on U-boats during the war never came home. The highest casualty rate of any branch of military service in any nation in the entire conflict. Higher than bomber crews, higher than infantry. They were the enemy. They were also young men, many of them teenagers, who followed orders into steel coffins beneath the Atlantic and never returned. The Allies paid an enormous price of their own. Over 3,000 merchant ships sunk, 14 million tons of vital cargo lost to the sea, more than 30,000 merchant sailors killed. These were civilians, most of them, volunteers who signed up to sail unarmed cargo ships through waters they knew were filled with submarines. They carried no weapons, they had no armor. Their only protection was the thin steel hull beneath their feet and the escort vessels sailing alongside them. They knew the odds every time they left port. They sailed anyway, because if they didn't, Britain fell. Many merchant sailors survived one sinking only to sign on for another voyage. Some survived 2, 3 torpedoings and still went back to sea. There was no draft for the merchant marine. These men chose this work, knowing what it meant. The average age of a merchant sailor killed in the Atlantic was 26. Some were teenagers. Others were in their 60s. They came from every corner of the British Empire and from nations beyond. Norwegian, Greek, Indian, Chinese, American. The forgotten army of the Atlantic. Without them, nothing else in the war mattered. Every soldier who landed on the beaches of Normandy arrived on a ship that a merchant sailor brought across that ocean. After the war, the merchant sailors received almost no recognition. No parades, no monuments, no veterans' benefits in many countries. The men who had kept Britain alive were expected to quietly return to civilian life and forget what they had seen. Many couldn't. The nightmares of burning oil on water, of friends drowning in the dark, of torpedoes striking at 3 in the morning, stayed with them for decades. It was not until the 1980s and 90s that most nations finally recognized their merchant marine veterans with the same honors given to military personnel. By then, most of the men who had sailed the Atlantic convoys were already gone. The debt was acknowledged, but it was acknowledged too late for the men who earned it. Charles Goodeve received the Order of the British Empire for his contributions to the war effort. A modest honour for a weapon that helped save an entire nation from starvation. After the war, he returned to science, serving as director of the British Iron and Steel Research Association and elected Fellow of the Royal Society. He died in 1980, aged 76, largely forgotten by the general public. Stuart Blacker, the eccentric inventor whose rejected spigot mortar became the heart of Hedgehog, finally saw his life's work vindicated. History rarely remembers the engineers. It should. Today, every major warship in the world carries some form of forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon. The Russian RBU rocket launcher series, the American ASROC torpedo system, the British Limbo mortar, which served well into the 1980s. The hardware evolves with each generation. The fundamental principle that Charles Goodeve fought for remains exactly the same. You attack while you can see your target. You don't sail past it and hope for the best. This seems so obvious now that it's hard to imagine anyone ever disagreeing. In 1940, it took a stubborn Canadian chemist to make the obvious real. They laughed at his backwards weapon. They said the charges were too small. They said the Navy knew best. They said 20 years of doctrine couldn't be wrong. And while they debated in offices and conference rooms, merchant ships burned across the Atlantic. Sailors drowned in oil-black water. Convoys scattered into the night, each ship alone and terrified. Britain came closer to defeat than most people today realize. Until one man who refused to accept the way things were proved every one of them wrong. 47 U-boats. 47 submarines that never sank another ship. 47 crews that never torpedoed another convoy. Why do we shoot backward when we could shoot forward? The answer to that question changed the Battle of the Atlantic. It changed the war. And it proved something that matters far beyond 1942. That the most dangerous enemy of progress isn't ignorance. It's the certainty that the way things have always been done is the way they must always be done. Charles Goodeve refused to accept that certainty. And because he refused, because he kept fighting when his own admirals told him to stop, 47 U-boats were destroyed, and thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives were saved. Now you know.